Welcome to Getting to Well-Being. This session is about the compass of shame. I am Rochelle Ladravis, and this is my learning journey. So I'm going to start with the compass of shame, but I'm going to start first with explaining this being able to regulate. And so first I'm going to take a really close look at this window of tolerance. And I'm going to come back to this again, and I'll use a different visual for this. But this window of tolerance has a great deal to do with being able to regulate. And so I want you to think of that very center section and looking at that where it's green. And I like to view the brain. I call it the simple view of the brain. So the brain stem down there in the bottom is that survival brain. And then you move up to the middle, the emotion parts of the emotional state. And then you move up top to the front, and that is the executive state. So I like to think of the brain in just that very simple view when I'm explaining, because we don't need to get into the whole intricacies of the brain and how powerful it is. But if I'm in my executive state, then I'm in that green zone area. I'm in that area of optimal arousal. That means that I'm in my window of tolerance. It means that I am able to feel and think at the same time. I feel safe here. I'm right here. I'm in the right now. I am open. I'm curious. I'm not being reactive. I'm not getting defensive. I'm in a really good awareness, an awareness of my boundaries, maybe myself and maybe others. If I'm in this green area, I'm in the optimal arousal zone, I'm in my executive state. I can think, I can problem solve, and I can come up with solutions. So this is where we want ourselves, and this is where we want our kiddos in our classrooms to be. We want them to be in that optimal arousal zone. But we know that we're not always in that optimal arousal zone. We know that our kiddos are not always in that optimal arousal zone. So I want you to think about a literal window, a window that slides up and down. So when I get into another part of that basic 3 parts of the simple brain, when I get into that emotional part of the brain, or I get into that survival part of the brain where I could be really explosive when I'm in there, I have 2 different areas that I can go to. I can be what's called hyper arousal zone, or I can go hypo arousal zone. So think of that as a window that slides up and down. And so depending on which way I go, and I'm going to go a little deeper on this and just on the next slide, so just bear with me a second. So if I am becoming very tense, if I'm very impulsive, if I'm getting some anger, if I'm getting some rage, I'm becoming explosive, I am emotionally overwhelmed, I'm unsafe, I've got racing thoughts, my window is closing. What can create some of those types of things, the signs that that's where I'm at, that's where I am at? Things could be not getting to sleep the night before, waiting for somebody to come home. Not getting any sleep again the night before because you're concerned about somebody in your household that hasn't woken up yet, and you know that there could have been some issues over the weekend, and so you're concerned for them. I think back to the ACEs score, And those things that happen to us, those adversities that happen to us that create traumatic events that we just can't handle. And so I could be in that hyper arousal zone. So my window is closing because of all of those things that are happening to me, around me. But I could also be that hypo. And that hypo is the opposite. It's more that no energy, you're not there. Maybe you're feeling ashamed. You're very passive. You've shut down. You've disconnected. Your emotions are numb. So you're kind of that opposite of the emotions overwhelming. You're numb. But what happens is the same thing. That window continues to close. So maybe you witnessed something very traumatic, and that has shut you down because your survival brain is trying to take you to a place where you can cope with it. Your survival brain is taking you to no energy so that you can move away from it emotionally. So lots of things happen to us. I'm going to go back to that ACEs and those 10 questions that we ask. It could be seeing and hearing a lot of yelling. It could be somebody else being abused in the home and you're witnessing it. It could be just even being in poverty. It could be a situation where you have somebody that is incarcerated. It could be separation in a family. It could be divorce in a family. And as we ourselves and as our children accumulate, I'll use that word, accumulate more of those adversities, our window of tolerance, that optimal arousal zone, closes and closes and closes and closes. And the higher that score, 3, 4, 4 becomes very significant in the adversities that you have had, creating traumatic experiences that put you into that survival mode very quickly. And so what has happened is with those adversities, a lot of kiddos, a lot of us have had positive supports, and we've been able to overcome those. And so our optimal arousal zone, that window of tolerance, has stayed open. But a lot of kiddos, a lot of people didn't have those supports. They didn't have a caring adult to go to. They didn't have those positive interactions that helped you learn how to regulate yourself when these things were happening. So there can be some positive things that can occur when those adversities happen. And what we do is we learn how to cope with them, and we compartmentalize them. We put them in a place that is safe because we've learned how to deal with those kinds of adversities. And we haven't had very many of them. But too many of our families, too many of our kiddos have had way too many adversities over time, over time, over time. And think about using your fist and etching something in. It's not a soft sketch, it's an etch. And so when those adversities happen over time, repeatedly, and we don't have the support systems in line to help us to tolerate these stresses, our window closes. And what happens is we either become hyper aroused or hypo arousal. And so this is where the compass of shame comes in. If I am hyper arousal, I'm probably more on the left side and the right side. I'm going to be somebody that attacks others, or I attack myself. So it's more that outward type of thing that you see. So does that make me a bad person because I'm attacking others or I'm attacking myself? No, I'm not a bad person. I just don't know how to regulate myself when I go there. Then those actions, those words that might be said, that's when it becomes obviously an issue. So you start blaming, you lash out verbally and or physically. and it's turning the tables so that the other person gets attacked. It's also that just attack on yourself. It's putting yourself down, not giving yourself the positives. It's coming and starting a conversation right away that starts with, I'm worthless type of comments and attitudes. So that's where you go, some people. That's where they can go when they're dysregulated. And that gets you out of that window of tolerance because you can't tolerate anything anymore, sends you into your survival brain, and it is that hyper arousal is where you're at. So now the hyper arousal is those kinds of people that withdraw or they avoid things. So obviously you know what withdrawing is, you know what avoiding is. So when we're dysregulated and we're maybe in the emotional part or we're in the survival part of the brain, you go away, you don't want to be around other people. Maybe there's running, maybe there's hiding. Maybe it's a student that sits in the corner of your room and doesn't want to engage. So does that mean that they're a bad person? No, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to be thinking about interact with this empathy that I talk about too. And I want to somehow help that student or help that adult learn how to regulate themselves so that they're not always withdrawn. I want to help them regulate themselves so that they're not in that avoidance place. Because in the avoidance place, it can be some thrill seeking that can be risky. It can be abusing drugs and alcohol, which we know is very risky, and then that denial. So that would be the hypo-arousal. And when you're dysregulated, you can go to any one of those four. And sometimes you might be jumping from self-attack to avoidance. You might jump from withdraw to self-attack. You can be within any of those. I can't for certain say I always attack others because there's times where I'm putting myself down instead. So we can move in and out. You're not a one type of person when you get dysregulated. But the thing about this that I think is helpful is when I'm having an issue, whether it's with a student, whether it's with another adult, if I can recognize and I can have this understanding of where somebody else might be coming from, that's going to help me to regulate myself and potentially help them co-regulate with me. So I look at it as just more of that social awareness. And if I can recognize where the other person is coming from, it's definitely going to help me. So now here's just another window of that hyperarousal, and it talks about the regulation, the dysregulation. So if I'm hyperarousal, this is where I'm obviously outside of my window of tolerance. I don't feel comfortable. I'm going to hit those areas of attacking others or attacking myself. As your window shrinks, then what happens with your stress and the traumas that you have had creates those windows to shrink. And so what we can do to help us expand that window, to help me regulate myself, is to do things, maybe listening to music helps me to calm myself. Maybe it's a type of breathing. Maybe it's a hobby. Maybe it's how do I ground myself? I put my feet on the floor so that I can feel them. Maybe I do something with my hands so that it takes my attention away from all those emotions and the adversities that I am feeling to help me get out of that hypo and that hyper arousal states. I have to regulate. And sometimes regulating does not happen very fast. You know, there are times if you're really out of sorts, it could be up to 15 minutes. So I want to leave you with interact,